I am speaking with Adam Duncan. He is with the Public Affairs Office at the Independence Nat'l Historical Park in Philadelphia, a city I'm getting a chance to visit very soon. But today, I'm just speaking to Adam Duncan by phone, through the telephone. Adam, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Cameron. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
So let's start with the very basics. What is Independence Nat'l Historical Park?
Independence Nat'l Historical Park is a unit of the National Park Service. We encompass about 55 acres in Old City, Philadelphia, and basically we cover all the sites relevant in Philadelphia to the founding of the United States. Prominently, Independence Hall would be the major site most people would know off the top of their head. They may not know necessarily that it's a national park. It certainly is one of many buildings that we operate for the public in Philadelphia, and that's probably the most significant building in American history. It's where the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, and Perpetual Union, and the U.S. Constitution were debated, adopted, and signed.
Now, anybody who has seen National Treasure will probably know the answer to this question. But this is a Masonic podcast, so what are some of the Masonic connections to the park, to kind of the founding of the United States of America in general?
Well, when the movie National Treasure first came out, we got a lot of questions. It's since kind of died off naturally because it's been many years since the movie first premiered. But also, we get a lot of questions, Masonic questions too. For about 8 years, I gave the tours of Independence Hall, long before I was a Mason. And a lot of questions came up. Masons would ask about certain features of the building. And a lot of that kind of comes out in National Treasure, although it is a movie. Let me just qualify that. It is a movie. A lot of it is for the movie and not specific to anything that's actually there. For instance, I believe his name's Benjamin Gates. Nicolas Cage's character finds a little compass and square on the brickwork on the roof of Independence Hall. That is not there. I promise you that I checked. It's just for the movie. But one of the things that a lot of Masons ask is that the assembly room of Independence Hall, the actual building, I should say, is called the Pennsylvania State House. It's the colonial capital and the early state capital for Pennsylvania. Really, construction was between 1732 and ultimately 24 years its completion in 1756 with the addition of a bell tower. But a lot of Masons will ask that the assembly room of Independence Hall, the room where the Declaration and the Constitution was signed, is set up a lot like a Masonic lodge. And they kind of question the intent. Was it designed specifically as such? And the reason why it's kind of set up like a lodge is the president of the Pennsylvania Assembly would sit in the east on a raised platform, what's called a dais, speaker's dais. And that is true, although specifically I cannot find in any of the historical content or any of the records of the building that it was purposely done, set up in the east, because the building does host the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. It also hosts the governor's office on the second floor. So it's really the absolute state house in colonial times for all three branches of Pennsylvania government. We do have stories that in 1732 that Masons, led by Benjamin Franklin, laid the cornerstone of the building. That's more Masonic lore than it is actual factual history. We have no records of the cornerstone ceremony taking place. None that I've been able to find. Certainly I've been in the basement and the foundation area of Independence Hall. There is no cornerstone to be found. So sometimes we do get those questions a lot. Also, one of the many buildings that we have is Carpenter's Hall. Carpenter's Hall is a trade union. They're the original owners of the building. It's also where the First Continental Congress met in 1774. But on top of their building is a compass and square, actually pointing to the sky. So we're familiar with it pointing down. Theirs is pointing up on the weather vane. Their trades, so certainly some of the members were Freemasons, but a lot of them were also, builders, stone masons. They were architects, all sorts of things. We do know that there is a name on one of the books, the Masonic lodges, at that time period when Independence Hall was being designed and constructed. The name that appears is Andrew Hamilton. Another name that appears is Edmund Woolley. Now, can I tell you for sure that Andrew Hamilton and Edmund Woolley were the same two Andrew Hamiltons and Edmund Wooleys that designed Independence Hall? I do not know that for 100% certainty. If those are the same two guys. It's possible, and it's possible that they built into the building, that they face the assembly room in the east. We don't know. There's no record specifically mentioning that, but we do know that two men by the name of Andrew Hamilton and Edmund Woolley kind of oversaw the design and the construction of the building. Hamilton being a member of the Pennsylvania Assembly and involved in the design. Two of those identical names show up at St. John's Lodge in Philadelphia around the 1730s. So it's speculation to say it's 100% them, but it may be.
I want to go back to something you mentioned near the start, because this is something that's applicable to a lot of Masonic buildings, Masonic temples, and even ourselves with Square and Compass Promotions. We organize tours of either in person or virtual, organized tours of the Windsor Masonic Temple, but many Masonic buildings, Detroit, Philadelphia, Bay City, the Scottish Rite Cathedral, they will host public and private tours of their buildings. You mentioned, early that you started out there and you spent, I think it was 8 years, you said, as a tour guide. What do you think is the key to facilitating a successful tour? How do you get people, how do you connect with your audience, get them to enjoy the space, and just what type of advice would you have for Masonic buildings, temples, ourselves at Square and Compass, who are facilitating public tours of some of our Masonic landmarks?
Well, one of the things that I would point in the National Park Service, a lot of people would call us tour guides, the people giving the tour, the National Park Service rangers, the uniformed staff that you see presenting the history. In the Park Service, we actually call those interpreters, not because they interpret one language into another, but they tell the story, they interpret the story of the resource and apply it, make it applicable to people today. Whether if it's an object, every object, especially a historic object, has a story. It could be the story of the people who made that object. It could be the story of the person that owned that object. It could be the story of just the object itself, its history, its provenance. So we follow Freeman Tilden, the 7 principles of interpretation of Freeman Tilden. He's one of the people that we study as National Park Service interpreters and his principles. I won't get into all those principles, but one of the things that I learned in my training with the National Park Service and just in the field giving the tours is you have to be engaging. We face a huge audience, especially in Philadelphia. On any given day, and I'm talking pre-pandemic, we could have visitors up to 80 per tour to Independence Hall. That could range from World War II or combat veterans taking the tour of the country from Washington, D.C. to New York and Boston, to Chinese visitors who are doing the same thing, and a lot of them aren't fluent in English. To kindergarten groups that come through the building. So we give a tour to 80 people, roughly, from all sorts of backgrounds, from all over the world, to English speakers to non-English speakers. Some people have a very good base in American history, the foundation of American history, especially the early colonial period, maybe Civil War. And that's a hard group to talk to when you're trying to explain some pretty complex ideas that would unfold during the American Revolution. Today, some of these ideas of free speech that are enshrined in our Constitution, freedom of religion, freedom of public assembly, are, we kind of take it for granted because we're so used to it. But back then, these ideas, and I always say Independence Hall is a laboratory. It's a political science laboratory, taking these concepts coming out of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment and applying them to a new form of government. Those are some challenging things to talk about, especially with a very diverse audience from all sorts of backgrounds. One of the things that you have to do to get them in immediately is to be engaging. In the first 3 minutes, if you don't say something that the people on the tour can connect with, I think you're going to lose them. And that's just my personal opinion based upon my experience. So being able to connect them, and I'm not saying that you have to dumb down your tours because you have so many different people, especially with kids. These are hard concepts to understand for some kids. But you have to make a tour that's engaging, that touches on points for everybody. Meaning, in my program, I'll talk about some of these complex ideas of the American Revolution and the Enlightenment, but I'll also take time out to add in things that will be engaging for children that they can understand, such as, yes, this is the room, really, where the Declaration of Independence was signed. And then I'll ask questions, kind of like a facilitated dialogue, where I'll lead people through the tour by asking questions and making them think more so than just listening to me and what I have to say for 30 minutes. So those are some of the techniques that we use, that I use, when giving a presentation, especially to a large group. Since the pandemic, our numbers are a little bit smaller, so you don't see as broad of an audience. But those are techniques that I use, and especially being in a room like the Assembly Room of Independence Hall, there's a lot of artifacts that you can talk about. And I always hate to, and I kind of say, I hate to do a furniture tour. I don't want to get into all the furniture and everything, and people naturally will ask those questions after the program, but rather than incorporate it, I pick out some of the more interesting objects that we have in our collection, such as Thomas Jefferson's walking stick, the chair that George Washington sat in while presiding over the Constitutional Convention. Later, Brother Benjamin Franklin is overheard by James Madison talking to the Pennsylvania delegation, and he's overheard wondering, he says, to paraphrase him, during the course of the sessions here, I've long stared at the carving, the painting on the back of the president's chair. And I wondered if the artist intended for it to be a rising sun on the horizon or a setting sun on the horizon. And now at length I have the happiness to know that it is indeed a rising sun and not a setting sun. So I think the use of quotes also will help make that connection to the place where we're standing, where they're standing. Because even if you're just standing in an empty room, that empty room has history. Those walls, if they could talk, could present that history. So as a person doing the tour, you kind of have the responsibility to bring those stories in that empty room to life, and those artifacts to life, and the people that were so influential in those historic events back to life. Franklin, probably of all of them, is the hardest one to ever understand. Historians will constantly say, I know all about Benjamin Franklin, but I really don't know him. And so it's our job as tour guides and interpreters, as we call ourselves in the National Park Service, to really kind of boil that down, put your own personal spin on it, because I think when you're giving a tour, your personality can go a long way. If you're monotone and talk like this, you're not going to be very engaging, and people are going to kind of tune you out.
Well, and that's, there's a lesson in there when it comes to Masonic ritual as well, right? That last part that you said, you can always tell a new Mason from kind of a monotone delivery, often a monotone delivery of ritual and of their lectures. I always say even if the words are the same, you should always be able to tell lectures apart based on who's saying them, because you should always try to add your personality to the lecture, to the ritual. You want to make it meaningful for yourself, and that in turn makes it meaningful for whoever's receiving that piece of work, whether it be at a degree or an installation or whatever it might be, right? It's and I think whatever you do, it's important to provide your own. You want your personality to shine through, kind of, in whatever it is that you might be doing.
Absolutely. And I think that's very important in public speaking. That's a challenge. To speak in front of a group of people that you don't know, and a group of people that you do know. There's this formality that makes us scared of it. I know the very first time I ever gave a speech to a large room, I was 15 years old. And even though I was very well versed in everything I was going to say, I had it committed to memory. You still forget parts, and later you're like, oh man, I forgot to say this or I forgot to say that. But as long as you deliver it, and one thing that you have to know is that you're going in knowing more than most people will know in your audience. So you got to overcome that fear, and you got to make your presentation your own and put your own personality onto it, especially if you're talking about Masonic ritual. That can go a long way for a newly raised Mason, depending on, it doesn't really matter on what level, but I certainly remember the ritual when I became a Master Mason very well, because my worshipful master who did it had a larger-than-life personality, and it really made me think, and I think that's an important thing.
So, going back to this, impacts your work, obviously, but park services more in general, perhaps, or just historical buildings. We at the Windsor Masonic Temple are engaged in a project called For the Next 100 Years. We are working on acquiring different grants and fundings to do some maintenance and renovations to our Masonic Temple. So it'll be around for another 100 years, because we just celebrated 100 years. This is our 100th anniversary, actually, 2022.
Wow, that's great.
It is, and it's one of those. It's just the Windsor Masonic Temple is such a landmark in the city of Windsor, but that's true for almost every Masonic building, Masonic temple. So many of them are landmarks of their towns and communities and cities, and as well, National Historical Park, the Liberty Bell. Those things are landmarks of Philadelphia and of the region as a whole. The tri-state area. Why is it important not only for people to learn about and know about these things, these buildings, these landmarks, but also to have them and to have the money spent on preserving and maintaining them? Because people could argue, you can just take a picture of it and put it in a textbook. But why is it important that the actual physical structures and the buildings themselves, and even the documents contained therein, are preserved for people to actually see and touch and be a part of?
Yeah, I'd like to go one step further, especially with Independence Hall and the buildings that make up Independence Nat'l Historical Park. They're Philadelphia icons, they're regional icons, and really they're national and international icons. I think on any given day on a busy summer season, we would see visitors from almost every country in the entire world represented. We'd see over 18,000 visitors a day that come through to see the Liberty Bell. The Liberty Bell, and a lot of artifacts. The bell itself is an artifact. It was in the Tower of Independence Hall. We don't know if any bells tolled on July 4th of 1776. All we know is that all the bells in the city of Philadelphia rung on July 8th of 1776 to call the citizens together on Independence Square to hear the very first public reading of the Declaration of Independence. That copy that was used is actually part of the park's collection and gets displayed in a little building next to Independence Hall. Any artifact is just that. I have my grandfather's watch, his pocket watch, that he carried with him every single day. I didn't know about it until long after he passed, and my grandmother gave it to me. It's broken. It's been broken for 50 years. To him, he probably kept it just because it was a nice watch, and he always intended to get it fixed, and he never did. To me, its value is just as important as a broken watch because it tells a story of him. And that's what the Liberty Bell, it's a cracked bell, but it tells a story of liberty. It tells a story of how imperfect that liberty can be. It tells a story of all the events and all the groups that have associated with it over the years, from the women's suffrage movement to the civil rights movement. Dr. Martin Luther King actually hosted sit-ins around the bell. He visited the bell. So any artifact has a story to tell, and that story is the important story. I always tell people that I always like to quote George Santayana, and I say, those that forget their history are condemned to repeat it. And that's very true. This is our story, not just a story of British North America, not just the story of Spain or the explorers, all that. It's all of our story. It's our history. It's where we've come to this point in time. Whether it's the history of Canada, our history is very intertwined. Is all the way through. So it's all of our story. It's the story of slavery. It's the story of the Civil War. These are events that impact world history that take place, especially Independence Hall. It's considered to be an UNESCO World Heritage Site because it has significant history. It has a significant impact on world history. That it tells the story of all of us. And I think any artifact, whether if it's a building is just an artifact that we can walk into and experience by walking in the same footsteps as the people associated with that history. It's a tangible object that connects us, more than just a picture in a textbook somewhere. By looking at an object, or if it's not too old, by touching an object, all of our objects you can't touch because they're all very, very sensitive. But by looking at that, and you can experience it, it has this emotion connected to it. And I think that's what makes these things so important, that people learn them, but not just learn them in a textbook, but go out and see where these places, where these things happen. I visit a lot of Civil War battlefields, especially Gettysburg. I try to go to Gettysburg as much as I can. And just to sit on that battlefield and to experience the same ground that, those men struggled under and died on. It's so much more of a connection than just reading their story in a book. So I encourage anybody who's interested in history. I encourage everyone to be interested in history, but also to go out and experience the places where that history occurred.
Now, going back to the more Masonic aspect of this interview, or of Square and Compass, there are, I think most people know, I say that, but that could be because of, I'm in my bubble all the time, but it seems like there's general understanding that, George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, that these people were Freemasons. Even in Detroit, right when you cross the border into Detroit, into America from Canada, there's a statue of George Washington in his full Masonic regalia. And every year, Zion Lodge out of Detroit has a wreath-laying ceremony there. And Benjamin Franklin has a statue in front of the Philadelphia Masonic Temple, shaking hands with, who's the other brother there? I can't think now. Thomas Jefferson? Anyways, there's statues. I think most people seem to understand that they were Freemasons. But in your opinion, and you can answer this kind of as a Mason or as a tour guide or as an interpreter for the Park Service or in your current position. How do you think that Freemasonry impacted the way that these founders, these men viewed the world, and do you think, what type of impact do you think it had on some of the decisions that they made? Obviously, even some of those more monumental decisions that kind of shaped the course of history up to today.
Yeah, well, certainly we know without a doubt there were 8 confirmed members, or I should say 8 confirmed Masons who were signers of the Declaration of Independence, 13 of the Constitution of the United States. Now, there were many more numbers. There's many more people involved that were not Freemasons. But what I think Freemasonry brought to the field, to the table during this time period, is it allowed the free expression of ideas without being judged or condemned in any way, without being arrested by your government for speaking. And I think that's one of the attributes that attracted Benjamin Franklin. Because you can talk about, what you want to say in a lodge, and not worry that someone is going to go out and say it. You can share these ideas. If you didn't like what the British government was doing, you could say it when you're next to another brother. Whereas, you say that out on the street, you're going to end up in jail like Benjamin Franklin's brother. There's certain things that you just couldn't say. And I think it's the embodiment of the Enlightenment period coming, the Renaissance period of human beings coming into their own to share ideas without fear of retribution, to share ideas as they come to your mind. Liberty is the truest form of freedom is liberty, is freedom of expression, freedom of thought. And I think that was a very big, important role in Benjamin Franklin's life, in John Hancock's life, and certainly George Washington's life. Now, there are a lot of Masons, well, I should say there are a lot of signers that are attributed to as Masons, but there is no specific history or proof that they were Masons, Thomas Jefferson being one of them. Where he's affiliated in a lot of cases, but we don't know as a matter of fact that he was actually a Mason. So the Masonic period, because you got to remember, in the 1730s, Freemasonry is just coming to America. There was really no specific lodge, and I've researched, I know a lot of Masonic historians have researched, they can't pinpoint the absolute first lodge in America. It was already known, Franklin, when he starts writing about the Freemasons before he becomes one. Certainly, there was already lodges there. Who they were constituted under is a different story. In a lot of cases, these constitutions aren't granted until later on from England. But we know Franklin was involved in one of the first lodges in Pennsylvania called St. John's Lodge. And it was out of a tavern, like probably many of those early lodges. They didn't have their own buildings. And there he would find prominent Philadelphians, prominent working men who were probably a lot more established, because Franklin was really, in the sense of the word, a boy. He was 25 when he was raised. And he's kind of getting his foot in the door in society, in Philadelphia society. There's a lot of other working people in the trades there that he would come to know, that would come to give him business. And later on, he becomes the printer for the Pennsylvania Assembly, as well as other colonial assemblies. I like to think, I don't know for a fact, but I like to think a lot of that business was because he was a Mason and other Masons knew of his excellent work, and they were kind of giving him some extra business.
Do you, or to what extent was, especially leading up to the Revolutionary War, and even perhaps afterwards, when you then had the other, very challenging task of kind of building upon the foundation and kind of creating America, was there discussion about the fact that there were and you see this with other wars, Freemasons on both sides of the fighting. The most famous example that I could think of that you brought up, Gettysburg, the friend to friend, brother to brother.
Mm-hmm.
If I recall correctly, and if I'm wrong, you can correct me, but I believe, in the Revolutionary War, King George was a Mason. And then in Canada, especially here where I'm from, there's a famous story of the commander of the, I guess, then British forces and the commander of the American forces meeting in lodge together in Amherstburg, in Thistle Lodge, the day before hostilities were started in the War of 1812. So how do you think that Freemasonry played a factor? Was there a consideration of the idea that there were brothers and Masons on both sides? Are other stories in the Revolutionary War similar to Gettysburg and the other stories you hear of Masons meeting across from each other in battle and extending brotherly love and support to one another?
I'm sure there are. I'm not a battlefield historian. I'm not really a military historian. I'm more of a social political historian. Certainly I know all the battles and the results and things, but in terms of these intimate details, I just haven't looked into it to be able to say, yeah, this battle, this nation, and that nation did that. Certainly, though, kind of to juxtapose that would be the same as, brothers fighting each other during the Civil War in the North and in the South. Families fighting each other. I believe it was Abraham Lincoln's wife's sister living in the White House who was married to a Confederate general during the Civil War. So there's all these nuances in our history. But in terms of specifics, Masonic stories on the battlefield, I wouldn't have any to share other than the one that you already mentioned.
The moving forward a few hundred years to 2022, you talked about coming back, the National Historical Park, Independence Hall, coming back from COVID. Certainly Freemasonry was affected by COVID as well. In Ontario, in-person meetings were suspended for about 2 years, give or take. We're just starting to return to our in-person meetings. I'm sure visitation and visitors was affected at all the national parks, especially those that are, in cities and as opposed to campsites and things like that. How have you found it, either as even just from the Masonic perspective, but also in your current position at Independence Hall? Are people returning enthusiastically? Are you seeing the numbers going up? Like, what's it been like, the return to kind of normalcy, or knock on wood anyways, or a return post-COVID? What's it been like for your perspective, either Masonically in your lodges, but also at Independence Hall?
I think our lodges Masonically are in the similar boat as what you guys are experiencing in Canada. It was baby steps. Certainly we answered to the Grand Master of our locality. For me, that's Delaware. And they were naturally very concerned throughout the pandemic. Now things seem to be changing, and a lot of the in-person stuff in terms of Masonic meetings are taking place. Whereas before it was, limited numbers, usually just the officers. I'm not even sure how many candidates were raised, if any, during the time period of the last 2 years. From a National Park Service perspective, Philadelphia, we're a federal agency, so we fall under the executive branch of the United States government, but we're also the center, or I should say, in a very large city, and that has its challenges. Now, as a whole, our buildings were closed in 2020. They've reopened in some capacity to the public since that time period. They're opening further as we get towards the summer. And really, I'm people are encouraged. I think after the last 2 years, people want to get out and experience these places. You know, our buildings may have been closed, but we still have, like I said in the beginning, we have 55 acres of land where people can come out, especially in an urban environment. They can come out and enjoy the weather. They can enjoy being outside. They can enjoy being in a park with trees, and kind of makes you feel you're almost not in an urban environment in Philadelphia when you do this thing. So I think people are excited to get back out, to learn history. Maybe they put off a trip for 2 years. They were supposed to come to Philadelphia. They haven't been able to. I think a lot of people are excited to get out there and explore, whereas they may not have been before.
Yeah, and as people return and are able to visit the buildings themselves and are more comfortable just being out once again, and with vaccination rates go up and all that, as that comfort level arises, whether it be Independence Hall, Freemasonry, or both, what lessons do you think there are from the past that people from, say, Independence Hall and the men and women who are part of Independence Hall, what lessons do you think people can learn that they can apply in 2022 as we move forward? Because I think, every generation likes to think it's special, and it has the most of struggles of any generation type of thing. And certainly we've had our struggles over the last few years, but historically, it's not like it was, rainbows and butterflies for the men who were at Independence Hall. I mean, there's been struggles throughout history. Certainly, 1776, there was a lot of struggle, and every generation. So, how did George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, how did they handle those struggles, those challenges, and what lessons do you think we can take from how they handled those challenges and apply it to ourselves as we recover from the last couple of years?
Well, we're certainly not the first society or first generation to go through a pandemic. George Washington went through a pandemic. The revolutionary generation endured several pandemics. Yellow fever was a big problem in Philadelphia. Even while Washington was the president of the United States and serving in Philadelphia, he actually moved from his residence, the president's house, which the site is part of the park, although unfortunately the house was torn down. He moved to another building about 8 miles away called Germantown. Today, Germantown is part of Philadelphia. Back then it wasn't, and he set up a residence there. The Germantown Lighthouse is what we call it, and it's actually part of the national park. They thought that yellow fever was spread because of bad air. There was a wall behind the State House or behind Independence Hall, and people recommended that the wall be lowered several feet to open up the air so it will flow through the city and get rid of yellow fever. There was a lot of misconceptions about yellow fever. In fact, they thought that blacks could not get yellow fever, and many blacks in Philadelphia actually became nurses and caretakers of people who were sick, and they themselves got sick. So there was a lot of things that we didn't know, especially I always tell people this wasn't the Stone Age. People could navigate around the world and land every single time within 100 feet of the same spot by using maps and looking at the stars. So it's not the Stone Age, but it was medically. We really don't start figuring things out until the Civil War, and in some cases as a result of the Civil War. Yellow fever isn't figured out until the building of the Panama Canal, and they figure out that it's mosquitoes that are responsible for transmitting the virus. So to apply that today and the lessons that are learned, it's just my opinion. My opinion is that we need to be patient with one another. We need to have a greater understanding of one another. To look at another person as someone that you have something in common with, no matter what it is. find something that we can all look at each other on and say, hey, you're just like me. I think that's an important, and like I said, that's just my humble opinion, is when we identify with each other, I think the world is better off. And I think we can reach great things as humans when we work together rather than working against each other and looking at each other for our differences. Rather than do that, I think looking at each other for what makes us human beings is more important.
And I think you're absolutely right. Patience. If we were a little bit more patient with one another, and even with perhaps some of the mistakes that are sometimes made, and even having charity towards if a mistake is made, right? Not assuming that a mistake or
absolutely
is equivalent to bad intentions or ill intentions, that type of thing. And there's a few Masonic lectures and principles which deal with those very things, right? Patience and temperance and charity, and applying those in a more broad sense, definitely can't help but perhaps help us recover quicker from some of the challenges and fissures and just the difficulties we've seen over the last couple of years. So
absolutely.
So I'm going to be, like I said, I can't wait to visit Philadelphia. I was there once before, very, very briefly, but I'm looking forward to going back. First place I want to visit, obviously, Independence National Park. But then what else, either as a Mason or just somebody who loves history, what else should I be checking out in Philadelphia and the surrounding area?
Well, I'm going to lead with that I'm biased. I'm biased because I work for the National Park Service, and we have 25 awesome buildings to visit, or I should say sites to visit in the park. Now, those are sites that kind of don't get recognized for what they are because everybody knows Independence Hall, at least in Maine. Everybody has heard of the Liberty Bell, at least in Maine. You may not know the specific history behind it, but you've at least heard of that. So that's when most people think of Philadelphia, of the sites that they're going to see, is Independence Hall and the Liberty Bell. There's so much more, especially in the National Park. We have the site of Benjamin Franklin's home. Now, unfortunately, it was torn down by his family long after his death because they were quarreling over who would get the property. They tried to sell it. It was a very large home. It's the largest freestanding home in Philadelphia at the time, as far as I can tell. It had over 33 lots combined to make up what's now called Franklin Court. So they try to sell it. They can't sell it. So they subdivide the lots. They tear down the house, and they sell it off piecemeal to kind of get the money, so to speak. So certainly Franklin Court, the National Park Service, with the city of Philadelphia in the 1950s and 60s, we excavated the site to see what we could find from Franklin's time period. We found a whole lot. As you walk through, you'll see two structures. There's these large steel outlines. We call them the ghosts of Franklin Court. We call them the ghosts because it's just the outline of this house to allow people to understand exactly where the house stood and its size, but not necessarily to convey what it looked like, because we don't have any idea what his house looked like. There's no paintings or contemporary, no drawings other than what Franklin did. He made one little sketch to his wife, Debbie, as the house was being built, because he's overseas. He's overseas for 11 years. And he makes 26 transatlantic crossings in his life. But while the house was being constructed, he's mostly not there. So he starts sketching out what she's describing to him. That's all we really know of the house. But you can see the foundation. You can see it's pretty. Franklin had one of the first flushing toilets in America. And I don't want to call it flushing in the modern sense. It was literally a trap door that hit a button. He had a very large bathtub that looked more like a lady's slipper. He could unlock the door from his room, from his bed, through a series of chains, and he could open the door that way. So the site kind of talks about some of these features of his house, but we don't know exactly what the house looked like. So you can walk through and you'll see inscriptions in the This was one of his privies. This is a privy from 1732 before Franklin is directly associated with the site. In fact, he later acquires the property in the front of Franklin Court. We call them the Market Street houses. Franklin owned 3 of them, but before he owned them, his father-in-law actually owned them, and that's where he meets his wife, who was about 14 years of age when he comes off the boat from Boston at the age of 17, and he walks down High Street. We call it Market Street today because of all the markets that were there, and he sees a young Debbie Reed, later to become Debbie Franklin, standing there, and he takes notice that he must have looked ridiculous because he was disheveled. I think he had a sock hanging out of his pocket. He had a couple pieces of small bread tucked under his arm. So he later acquires those properties, and he builds them as rental properties. And he later gives one of them to his son, Benjamin Franklin Bache, who operates the Aurora, a newspaper during the 1790s. You know, there's probably no more of a tumultuous time period in our history and politics than the 1790s. You know, it's the very first of any of these things happening. You know, it's before political parties were absolutely developed. Washington was president, and when he's no longer president, John Adams becomes president, and you start to see the rise of the political parties and the fighting between him and his vice president, Thomas Jefferson. So that's one of the sites that you can visit if you go into Franklin Court, the site of Benjamin Franklin Bache's printing office and where his actual residence was located. Below that is a museum dedicated to Benjamin Franklin. They have all sorts of cool artifacts. If you have the time, definitely check out the museum, the Benjamin Franklin Museum, which is actually about 30 feet below the archaeological site of his house. Just because we didn't have any room for a museum in the courtyard without building on top of the archaeology work that was done. So I definitely encourage you to go and check that out. See Congress Hall, which is next to Independence Hall. Congress Hall is where the first 5 Congresses met. It's where George Washington was inaugurated for his second term as President of the United States. It's where John Adams' only inauguration would take place in the House of Representatives chamber on the first floor of Congress Hall. Old City Hall is not only the old City Hall for Philadelphia, but it happens to be where the United States Supreme Court would meet when Philadelphia is the capital from 1790 until 1800. Certainly the Liberty Bell, to go through and see the museum. When you walk into the Liberty Bell Center, you're going to see the story first of the Liberty Bell. It takes you through kind of the bell's evolution from just being a bell in the tower of Independence Hall to being an international symbol for freedom and liberty. So definitely visit that. Of course, no visit to Franklin Court would be complete without visiting the grave of Benjamin Franklin himself. He's actually up a little bit farther away from where his courtyard is in the Christ Church burial ground. Christ Church is at 2nd, just north of Market Street, but Franklin and the burial ground, Franklin's grave, is at 5th and Arch Street, right across from the United States Mint. And you can see his grave, his final resting place, but there's also several other signers of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution interred between the church and its burial ground. We have a ton of different buildings. Some of them are open right now. Some of them are closed seasonally. In the wintertime, we keep some buildings closed just because our visitation is smaller, our staff is smaller. So I always recommend people check the website, nps.gov/INDE, stands for Independence, the first 4 letters of the word Independence. That'll take you to our website. All of our buildings are listed there. All of our hours are listed there, our programs. Certainly check us out on Facebook with Independence NHP. We also operate several other buildings that are not yet open because of COVID. That is the Thaddeus Kosciuszko National Memorial, dedicated to the Polish hero of 2 continents. Thaddeus Kosciuszko became an officer in the American Revolution. He designs West Point, New York, and is involved in the Battle of Saratoga, and many others before he moves down to the Southern Campaign during the American Revolution. We also operate the Edgar Allan Poe National Historic Site up in about a mile away from Independence Hall and 7th and Spring Garden Street. Those two sites are not yet open, but we will announce when we have a date on reopening for those. Certainly, I mentioned Carpenter's Hall as being one of the meeting places of the first Continental Congress. It's a great place to go and visit. That's part of the park. We also have the second and first banks of the United States. The first bank is closed to the public. Normally, we're actually working on a renovation plan to get it open to the public. The second bank is under construction right now. It's part of the restoration of the roof. But normally, we have over 190 paintings done from life by famed artist Charles Wilson Peale, who opened the first museum in the United States here in Philadelphia. And his collection, after he passed away and his museum closed up, would later be auctioned off. And we were fortunate enough when the National Park was created in 1948, we inherited a large portion of the city's collection for preservation. So in our collection, we have over 3 million artifacts that we maintain behind the scenes as well. Some are on display, like in the assembly room of the Independence Hall. Some are not. So I definitely encourage anybody, come to Philadelphia, see Independence Hall, see the Liberty Bell, but go off the beaten path in the park and discover the National Park. But also, there's so many different sites, such as I think you had mentioned it before, the Masonic Temple. I think that's down while it's at North Broad Street. There's the Scottish Rite Cathedral, which is at Broad and Race Streets, and that's designed by a Mason, Horace W. Cantor. Completed in 1927. I mentioned some of the park sites and their connection with Masonic history. I think those are the big ones to visit. The site of Tavern, where St. John's Lodge first started, Franklin's Lodge, where he was first raised, no longer stands, but there is a historic marker right on Front Street. So Philadelphia is a city on a grid system. So you have Front, which is First Street. It was Front because it was the waterfront. Second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth. All the numerical streets run north and south. All the other side streets run east and west. But on Front Street, so just a few blocks down from Fifth Street, where Independence Hall is, you're going to find a historic marker dedicated to Tavern. In the United States, most U.S. Marines will identify with that site as being the birthplace of the Marine Corps, but it's also the birthplace of in Philadelphia, Freemasonry. The marker, they only give so much space on these historic markers. It does not mention St. John's Lodge or Freemasonry, but it does talk about Tavern as being the birthplace of the Marines. So I certainly encourage people to check out that Tavern as you walk through. You're going to walk through an absolutely lovely part of Philadelphia, what we call Old City and Society Hill, which is still mostly 18th and early 19th century buildings preserved.
So, this is something...
That's the short version, believe it or not.
No, Philadelphia is one of those cities, right? There's so much Masonically, so much historically, pop culture, Rocky. It's one of those cities that there's so much in it. I was there once briefly, and it's amazing how much history is packed into that city and that area. So I'm sure it would take a few weeks to actually see everything that there would be to see. That's for sure. Even in Independence National Park, I'm sure one visit probably isn't sufficient to see all the amazing things that are there.
Not even close. Yeah, not even close.
This is something I've been...
You have to spend a couple of weeks if you want to see everything. And even then, you're still not going to see everything. Somebody's always going to tell you, did you check this place out? And you didn't see it. I like history, of course, but I also like getting off the beaten path, and I like being in nature as much as I can. So you get back into Fairmount Park. Philadelphia has the largest urban park in the world, and it's called Fairmount Park. It's over 8 miles long, and it's got hiking trails down on a little creek area called the Wissahickon Creek. And when you're back in that area, you're going to come across these statues that you weren't even expecting. monuments. There's a couple to some of the native chiefs. There's a statue of William Penn back in the park. You're walking through these small little creek bed, and it's beautiful. So if you have the time, you can see like the Fairmont waterworks. It's the original waterworks of the city of Philadelphia. We're talking about the late 1790s, early 1800s, and we're talking about wooden pipes, the art museum, Betsy Ross. There's so many historic sites that you can go on and on and on and still not see them all.
Actually, you brought up, I'm just out of curiosity, you mentioned the statues or monuments to First Nations or original peoples in Fairmont Park. To your knowledge, were there any, or are there records of any, I mean, I know there are plenty now, but at the time, founding America moving forward, are there records of any First Nations, original peoples joining Freemasonry? In Canada, we have records of, named after, somewhere very close to where I live, Chief Tecumseh being a Freemason. Modern times, right, I've seen First Nations people join and use, in place of the volume of the sacred law, using an eagle feather, putting an eagle feather on the altar during their initiation. I'm just curious, though. Just when you said that, it made me think about Chief Tecumseh, who was a very prominent First Nations leader, took part in the War of 1812, but also was a Freemason himself. Just curious if there's any records of that you're aware of.
That would be a good question for the Pennsylvania Grand Lodge. My knowledge, it's a little outside of my knowledge in terms of Masonic history. But if you go to the Grand Lodge on your visit, that might be a good question for them. I just don't know to answer that question.
Something I've been thinking a lot about, and I think this is a good question for yourself and a good way to wrap up, is it possible to it's clear talking to you that you very much love history, by the answers that you give and just your passion for the park and for your job, and it's also clear that you love Freemasonry. And this goes back to the being an interpreter, being somebody who is in charge of public relations, but also, for Freemasonry in general, is it possible, or is it possible to communicate? I'm trying to think of how to put this. Like, how do you get somebody to fall in love with history, with Freemasonry, with whatever it might be? Is it possible to do that, or is it kind of a matter of chance? Like with music, for example, right? I didn't wake up one morning and say, this song I'm going to hear today is going to be my favorite song. It's just something that happens when you hear it, and it just speaks to you, right? With history, even with Freemasonry, is it possible to, or how do you communicate, the thing you love, history, Freemasonry, whatever it might be, how do you communicate that to others and perhaps encourage them? Maybe if they have the attitude of, I've never liked history, how do you communicate to them why it is that perhaps they should like it, and encourage them to take another look at something they may have up to now been overlooking?
Well, you're not going to reach everybody all the time. The old saying is, you can lead a horse to water, you can't make him drink. And it's the same thing. If somebody's just not interested, they're not interested. But also at the same time, I don't know anybody that's not interested in music. I don't know anyone. It might be a different type of music than you or I like, but everybody's interested in it. So I think a good way, especially just as an individual, not as a National Park Service Ranger or a Freemason, just as an individual, I live what I'm into. My wife will constantly tell me, I love music as well. She's like, you're always doing stuff with history. You're always doing Masonic stuff. You're always researching I've gotten so many people, so many of my friends that are like, you should be a teacher. You should teach history. You've taught me more over, dinner than I've ever learned in school. And I could never remember all of this. And I'm going to remember what you told me, what we were talking about. So I just live it. I love history. I'm constantly talking about history to my friends and my family. Some of them are like, all right, man, enough. But they always know the details. They always know when the Declaration of Independence was signed. They always know about the Constitutional Convention. So some people I've certainly just through my conversation and my personality have said, wow, you got me inspired, man. I want to learn more. Because I touched that one aspect of their life. I made that connection between their lives today and the lives of people who have been dead for 200 years. And I've gotten that because of that connection, wanting to know more. And sometimes it's, hey, I just read a couple, blogs on the internet. But other times it's, hey, I bought this book, I read this, I read that. You've inspired me. And I think that's, as Masons, as teachers, as historians, that's the best way. It's just to live what you like and wear it out on your sleeve. I've always loved history. When I was a kid, everybody was like, you're a nerd, you're a history nerd, man. And it's true. Looking back, yeah, I was a history nerd. And it kind of set me down this pathway to where I am today. And Freemasonry is a big part of us, is our history. And learning that history and sharing that history. So I think the more that we live what we like, the more others around us will be inspired and encouraged to learn more. And if there's any way to actually convey it to a stranger that doesn't know us, it's trying to connect with them about what they're interested in and applying something that happened 200 years ago on why they should care about that event that took place and how it impacts their lives today.
And I really like what you said about creating those connections. I really think that's the most important thing from almost anything you do, right? Can you create a connection between whatever it might be, whether it be an emotional connection or I suppose it always has to be some sort of emotional connection. Like, how can you connect this in such a way that the person finds it interesting or relevant or, it's whatever it might be to their own lives, creating those connections historically, Masonically, I think is such an important thing. And it's clear by, you mentioned the website, it's clear by checking out some of the online items related to Independence National Park, right? That's what you guys are trying to do. You're trying to connect what happened 200, 250 years ago with what's happening today and making it relevant to people's lives, which is a very good thing and something Freemasonry should also look at perhaps doing a little bit more. But no.
We're coming up on the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration, the creation of the United States, in 2026, and it's going to be a huge celebration. It's going to be in Philadelphia, and I think anybody who's interested, will find something that they're interested in through the 250th celebration. But also, history. It's just a fantastic thing to me because there's an answer to your problem out there. You just got to find it in the history books. It's all there. For thousands of years, societies have faced problems, in some cases greater than ours. In some cases, we're unique and we face far greater problems than the world's ever seen. But the foundation is there, rooted in world history, and it's in a book, and you got to go and find it. And that's what I love about history. That's kind of how I got into history field. In college, people were like, "Why do you want to do history?" I'm like, "Because there's an answer out there. I just have to find it."
That is absolutely true. That's a perfect, I think, statement of why history is so important. So you mentioned the website. I'll throw some links down in the description to this interview. But if you want to throw it again, people want to learn more about Independence Park. Obviously, there's the website, but I know you guys also got your socials. if you want to throw those out as well, like where can people find out more about Independence National Historical Park?
Sure. You can find us on our website, nps.gov. If you remember nothing else, remember that, nps.gov. It stands for nationalparkservice.gov. And then you can search for us within that and find Independence. You can search for all the national parks in the United States and find what interests you. We're also on social media. We're on Instagram at Independence NPS. We're on Facebook at Independence NHP. You can search for that term. We're on Twitter for Independence NHP as well.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me. It is very much appreciated.
Cameron, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Take care.